During the wedding of a successful black businessman, his 8-year-old son interrupts the ceremony and exposes the shocking truth about the white bride. The secrets that surface in front of the guests turn everything upside down. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Daniel Carter stood in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment, the city skyline glittering behind him. The evening light poured in, painting the room in warm, golden hues, but Daniel barely noticed. His mind was preoccupied behind him. His 8-year-old son Isaiah sat cross-legged on a pristine white couch, a tablet in his hands and headphones around his neck. Daniel smiled faintly, watching him. Isaiah had always been a bright kid, curious, observant, and sharp, beyond his years, but there was something fragile about him, a quiet vulnerability that Daniel both cherished and worried about. After all, Isaiah had already been through so much. Losing his mother at the age of 3 had left a mark, one that Daniel had spent the last 5 years trying to soothe. He had done his best to create a safe, loving environment, one where Isaiah would feel secure and valued. Still, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, and that was why, after much thought, he had decided it was time to move forward. He turned away from the window and cleared his throat. "Hey, buddy," he said. Isaiah looked up, pulling one side of his headphones off his ear. "Yeah, Dad." Daniel walked over and sat down beside him. "I need to talk to you about something important." Isaiah tilted his head, his dark eyes sharp with curiosity. "What's up, Daniel?" He took a deep breath. "You know how much I love you, right?" Isaiah's forehead crinkled. "Of course. And you know I've always tried to make sure you're happy." Isaiah nodded but stayed silent, sensing something bigger was coming. "Well," Daniel continued, "I've been seeing someone. Her name is Catherine, and I asked her to marry me." Isaiah's eyes widened. He sat up straighter, clutching the tablet in his lap. "Mary, yes. I wanted to tell you first because you're the most important person in my life." There was a long silence. Isaiah's expression was unreadable, and Daniel suddenly felt nervous. Maybe he should have prepared him better, eased into the conversation more gradually. "Is she nice?" Isaiah finally asked, and Daniel smiled. "She's wonderful, smart, kind, and beautiful. I really think you'll like her." Isaiah bit his lip, clearly deep in thought. "But what about Mom?" Daniel's chest tightened. "Your mom will always be a part of us, buddy. No one could ever replace her, but Catherine isn't trying to do that. She just wants to be here for us, to make our family whole again." Isaiah didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared down at his tablet, his fingers tapping nervously along the edge. "When do I meet her?" Daniel felt a wave of relief. "Soon. I was hoping we could all have dinner together this weekend." Isaiah nodded slowly. "Okay." But even as he said it, Daniel could see the hesitation in his son's eyes. The first meeting with Catherine went smoothly, or so it seemed. She arrived in a designer dress, her blonde hair shining under the soft lighting of the restaurant. Her smile was dazzling, and her voice was warm and confident. She made a point of complimenting Isaiah on his intelligence, asking him questions about his favorite subjects and hobbies. Isaiah answered politely, but something felt off to him. Catherine's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and the way she tilted her head as she listened made him feel like he was being studied rather than heard. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling lingered even after the evening ended. On the car ride home, Daniel was beaming. "See? I told you she was great." Isaiah forced a smile. "Yeah, she's nice." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. Over the next few weeks, Catherine became a more frequent presence in their lives. She brought Isaiah gifts, books, puzzles, and video games, and complimented Daniel on what a wonderful father he was. She always seemed to say the right thing, but Isaiah noticed the small moments when her mask seemed to slip, like the time she scolded him for leaving his shoes in the hallway, even though he'd always done it. And his dad had never minded, or the way she looked at him when he asked to sit next to Daniel at dinner as if he were being possessive. And then there were the comments, subtle at first, but enough to make him uneasy. "You know you're lucky to have a father like Daniel," she said one evening. "Not every child gets such opportunities." Isaiah frowned. "What do you mean?" Catherine's smile tightened. "Just that you should always be grateful. Some kids don't get second chances." Isaiah didn't know what she meant by that, but the tone made his stomach twist. Despite his unease, the wedding preparations moved forward. Catherine threw herself into planning, organizing fittings, tastings, and rehearsals. Daniel seemed happier than Isaiah had seen him in years, and Isaiah didn't want to ruin it. He tried to ignore his doubts and convince himself he was overreacting. But everything changed one afternoon when he overheard Catherine on the phone. He had been walking past her room when he heard her voice, sharp and low. "Of course I'll have access to his accounts once we're married. It's all lined up. I just have to keep the kid out of the way until then." Isaiah froze. "Don't worry about him," she continued. "He's just a spoiled brat. Once I get what I want, he won't be a problem anymore." Isaiah's heart pounded. He backed away from the door, his mind racing. He had to tell his dad, but would he even believe him? Catherine was so careful about the image she showed to everyone else, and that was when Isaiah decided he needed proof. That night, lying in bed, he thought about what he had heard. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let Catherine hurt his dad or take away everything they had built. He picked up his tablet and opened the voice recorder. Tomorrow he would start, gathering evidence no matter what it took. He would stop her. And with that, Isaiah fell asleep, unaware of just how dangerous the road ahead would be. Isaiah sat at the kitchen counter, his legs swinging nervously beneath the high stool as he picked at his breakfast. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint clinking of utensils were the only sounds filling the bright, spacious room. His father was out on business, and Catherine had taken over the house like she already owned it. She moved through the kitchen with practiced elegance, pouring coffee into a delicate porcelain cup as if she'd lived there for years. But Isaiah couldn't stop noticing the little things. The way her eyes skimmed past him without really seeing him. The slight downturn of her lips whenever he spoke. "Eat your eggs." "Isaiah," Catherine said, not even looking up from her phone. Isaiah's fork froze halfway to his mouth. "I'm not that hungry." Her eyes flicked up, then sharp and quick. "I didn't ask if you were hungry," I said. "Eat." The words were calm, but there was an edge to them that made Isaiah's stomach twist. He wanted to say something back, but he didn't. Instead, he forced himself to take another bite, feeling her gaze linger on him for a moment before she returned to scrolling through her messages. Later that day, Catherine's tone softened again, her voice like honey as she sat beside Daniel in the living room. Isaiah watched from the stairs, unnoticed as she laughed at one of his father's jokes and leaned in just a little too close. "She's trying too hard," Isaiah muttered under his breath, but no one could hear him. Catherine was perfect when his dad was around, supportive, charming, and warm. She even brought Isaiah little gifts like the puzzle book sitting unopened on his desk upstairs. But when they were alone, the warmth disappeared, leaving only icy smiles and sharp words. Isaiah was starting to see the cracks in her perfect mask, but he didn't know how to make his dad see them too. The breaking point came one afternoon when Catherine took Isaiah to a fancy boutique downtown. She called it a bonding trip, though Isaiah doubted she really wanted to bond with him as they walked past rows of sleek mannequins and glass display cases. Catherine kept a tight grip on his hand, her nails digging into his skin whenever he slowed down. "You need to stand up straight," she hissed when he tripped slightly on the edge of the carpet. "You're representing your father." Isaiah swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He wanted to pull away, but her grip tightened at the checkout counter. Catherine spoke to the clerk with a sweet, polished tone, but as soon as they stepped outside, she turned to Isaiah with a look that made his chest tighten. "You embarrassed me in there," she said. "Do you know how many people were watching? How many people will be talking about this tomorrow?" Isaiah felt his cheeks burn. "I didn't mean to. I don't care what you meant." Her voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "Your father might let you get away with acting like a burr, but I won't." Isaiah stared at her, stunned. She didn't even try to cover her anger this time. The ride home was silent, but Isaiah's mind was racing. He knew now without a doubt that Catherine wasn't who she pretended to be. But when he tried to talk to his dad that evening, Daniel brushed it off. "She's just under a lot of stress, buddy," he said. "Planning a wedding isn't easy. Easy, but Dad, she's doing her best to include you, and I need you to meet her halfway. Can you do that for me?" Isaiah's chest tightened. His dad wasn't listening. He didn't see what Isaiah saw, and that's when Isaiah decided he couldn't just tell his dad the truth. He had to show him. Isaiah's first chance came a few days later. He was walking past Catherine's study when he heard her voice, sharp and impatient. "I told you already it's all lined up," she said. "The prenup will hold until the assets are transferred. After that, he won't be able to touch them. The kid will be out of the way soon enough." Isaiah froze. "No, he doesn't suspect anything. He's just a child." Isaiah's hands clenched into fists. He pulled out his phone and hit record. holding it close to the crack in the door as Catherine continued to talk. "This isn't going to fall apart. You worry too much. Once I have what I want, I'll make sure he never causes problems again." Isaiah's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't understand everything she was saying, but he understood enough. He pressed stop on the recording and ran upstairs, shoving the phone into his pocket. His hands were shaking, but he felt a flicker of hope. He had proof now. The next day, Isaiah followed Catherine outside, pretending to play on his phone while she met with a man in a suit near the gate. He was too far away to hear what they were saying, but he took pictures of her angry gestures, the man's briefcase, and the way she kept glancing over her shoulder. When she caught him watching her, her expression turned icy. "What do you think you're doing?" "Nothing," Isaiah said quickly as she stalked toward him, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. "Stay out of my business," she hissed, "or you'll regret it." Isaiah didn't answer. He turned and ran back inside, but her words followed him, heavy and threatening. That night, Isaiah lay awake in bed listening to the faint sounds of Catherine and his father talking downstairs. He wanted to march down there and tell his dad everything, but he knew it wouldn't work. Not yet. He needed more evidence, something undeniable, so he spent the next few days collecting it. He recorded more conversations, took more pictures, and even went through Catherine's desk while she was out, snapping photos of documents with words he didn't fully understand, but knew were important. And with every new piece of evidence, his fear grew. Catherine wasn't just mean, she was dangerous. One evening while Daniel was working late, Catherine caught Isaiah going through her papers. "What do you think you're doing?" Her voice was sharp and low, her eyes flashing with fury. Isaiah froze. "I was just looking for my notebook," he lied. She stepped closer, her heels echoing in the empty room. "You listen to me, you little brat," she hissed. "I don't care what you think you know. You will not ruin this for me." Isaiah backed away, his heart pounding. "I'll tell my dad." Her lips curled into a cruel smile. "Go ahead, he'll never believe you." Isaiah stared at her, fear and determination swirling inside him. She might be right, but that didn't mean he was going to stop, because now more than ever he knew he had to protect his dad. Isaiah couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. Catherine's words replayed in his head over and over again. Threats laced with venom warnings disguised as casual remarks. Every time he thought about confronting her or telling his dad, the memory of her icy smile stopped him. She was too good at pretending, too good at twisting the truth. But Isaiah wasn't giving up. Not yet. He had already started gathering evidence, and now he was more determined than ever to see it through. He just needed to be careful. The days following Catherine's outburst were tense. She avoided him most of the time, but when they crossed paths, her smiles were sharper, her words more clipped. Isaiah could tell she was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. One afternoon, Isaiah waited until Catherine left the house for her dress fitting. He knew she'd be gone for at least 2 hours, more than enough time to dig through the papers she kept in her office. He crept downstairs, his heart pounding, and slipped into the room. The office was immaculate, the polished desk gleamed under the light from the chandelier, and framed photos of Catherine and Daniel lined the shelves. But Isaiah wasn't fooled by the perfect setup. He headed straight for the drawers, pulling them open one by one. Most of them were filled with harmless paperwork. Receipts, bills, and invitations to charity events. But the bottom drawer was locked. Isaiah gritted his teeth. He had seen Catherine use the key before, slipping it back into her purse after locking up. He'd have to move fast. Racing upstairs, he grabbed her purse from the foyer table and rummaged through it. The key was tucked inside a small zippered pocket. His hands shook as he pulled it out and ran back to the office. The lock clicked open, and Isaiah held his breath as he pulled out the files. The first folder made his stomach drop. It was a draft of a legal agreement, one that transferred ownership of several properties and accounts to Catherine in the event of Daniel's incapacitation. Isaiah didn't understand all the legal jargon, but he recognized enough to know it was bad. The second folder was worse. It contained private emails between Catherine and her lawyer detailing plans to isolate Daniel from Isaiah and push the boy into a boarding school for troubled youth. Isaiah's hands shook as he took pictures of everything. He couldn't believe how far Catherine was willing to go to get what she wanted. Suddenly he heard the front door open. Panic surged through him. Catherine wasn't supposed to be back yet. He shoved the folders back into the drawer, locked it, and sprinted upstairs, barely managing to toss the key back into her purse before she entered the room. "Isaiah?" Catherine's voice called out. He froze at the top of the stairs. "Yeah, what are you doing up there?" "Homework?" he lied, hoping his voice sounded steady. There was a pause. "Good," she said at last. "Keep it that way." Isaiah didn't sleep that night. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying everything he had seen. Catherine's plans weren't just cruel, they were calculated. She had thought of everything, and if Isaiah hadn't started digging, no one would have ever known. But now he had proof. He just needed to figure out the right moment to show it to his dad. The opportunity came the next morning. Daniel was in his office drinking coffee and flipping through emails when Isaiah knocked on the door. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said, smiling. "What's up, Isaiah?" Hesitated, the words caught in his throat. He wanted to spill everything, to show the pictures, play the recordings, and make his dad see the truth. But then Catherine appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him. "Breakfast is ready," she said sweetly, but the look she gave Isaiah was anything but kind. Isaiah swallowed hard and backed away. "Never mind," he mumbled, hating himself for losing his nerve over the next few days. Catherine tightened her grip. She started checking Isaiah's room while he was at school, rearranging his things and moving his tablet just enough to let him know she had been there. She began making snide comments in front of his father, planting seeds of doubt about Isaiah's behavior. "Maybe he's acting out because he's afraid of change," she said one night at dinner. "Kids can be so unpredictable, especially ones who have been spoiled." Daniel frowned. "Isaiah's not spoiled, I'm just saying," Catherine replied, sipping her wine. "He might need firmer boundaries. Children need structure." Isaiah clenched his fists under the table. She was trying to turn his dad against him, and it was starting to work. The final straw came a week before the wedding. Isaiah overheard Catherine on another phone call, this time with a man whose voice Isaiah didn't recognize. "I told you, he'll sign the papers right after the ceremony," she said. "And once that's done, I'll take care of the kid. Don't worry, he'll be out of the picture soon." Isaiah couldn't breathe. She wasn't just planning to take his dad's money. She was planning to take him away, too. That night, Isaiah recorded everything. He played back the phone call he had captured, the emails he had photographed, and the legal documents he had saved. He compiled it all into a single folder and saved it to multiple devices. Then he wrote a note to himself in case something went wrong. "Show Dad everything. Don't let her win." The next morning, Catherine cornered him in the hallway. "You've been snooping," she said, her voice dangerously low. Isaiah's heart pounded. "I don't know what you're talking about." She leaned in closer. "You think you're clever, don't you? But you're just a scared little boy, and no one's going to believe you. Not your dad, not the police. So do yourself a favor and stay out of my way." Isaiah refused to back down this time. "You're wrong," he said, his voice shaken but firm. "You don't get to win." Catherine's eyes flashed with anger. "We'll see about that," as she walked away. Isaiah felt his fear morph into determination. He was done hiding. The wedding was only days away, and he was ready to stop it no matter what it took. The day before the wedding arrived, faster than Isaiah had anticipated. The Carter mansion buzzed with activity as florists, decorators, and caterers filled the halls, transforming the grand estate into a spectacle fit for royalty. Isaiah stood at the top of the staircase, watching the chaos unfold below. Catherine flitted through the crowd like a queen overseeing her subjects. She directed the workers with sharp efficiency, her voice crisp and authoritative. To anyone else, she might have looked like the picture of elegance, but Isaiah saw past the polished exterior. He saw the way her eyes darted toward him every few minutes, sharp and calculating. She hadn't confronted him again since their tense exchange in the hallway, but Isaiah knew she hadn't. Let it go. She was waiting, watching, ready to pounce the moment he slipped up. But Isaiah wasn't planning to slip up. He had spent the last few nights fine-tuning his plan, going over every detail to make sure nothing went wrong. He had backups of the recordings, extra copies of the photos, and even printed versions of the emails in case anything happened to his devices. The problem was timing. He needed the right moment when the most people were watching, and Catherine wouldn't be able to lie her way out of it. That meant waiting until the ceremony, just before the papers were signed. It was written, risky, but Isaiah didn't see another way. That afternoon, while Catherine was out at her final dress fitting, Isaiah snuck into her office one last time. He had already collected most of the evidence he needed, but something kept pulling him back. He felt like there was more to find, something that would make his case undeniable. He moved quickly, rifling through the drawers and shelves, but most of what he found he had already seen. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed a slim envelope tucked behind a stack of books on the bottom shelf. His heart raced as he pulled it out and unfolded the contents. On the first page was a letter from Catherine's lawyer confirming her plans to transfer assets into her name immediately after the wedding. The second page was worse. It was a psychological evaluation marked with the name Isaiah Carter's stomach. Dropped as he read the words, early signs of behavioral instability, recommended placement in structured boarding environment. His hands trembled. Catherine wasn't just trying to take his father's money, she was trying to make it look like Isaiah was mentally unstable so she could get rid of him entirely. The sound of the front door opening snapped him out of his daze. Catherine was back. Isaiah shoved the papers into his backpack and sprinted out of the office, barely making it to his room before her heels clicked against the marble floors below. He locked the door behind him, his chest heaving as he tried to calm down. He had what he needed now, more than enough to prove what Catherine was planning, but the weight of it all pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He thought about his dad, about how happy he looked whenever Catherine was around. How was he supposed to destroy that happiness? How was he supposed to convince his dad to believe him over her? Isaiah closed his eyes and tried to steady himself, because he didn't have a choice that evening. Catherine made her move. Isaiah had just come downstairs for dinner when he saw her sitting on the couch with his dad, her hand resting on Daniel's knee as she spoke in hushed tones. Daniel's expression darkened as Catherine finished talking, and he turned to look at Isaiah. "Come here, son." Isaiah hesitated. "Now," Daniel said, his voice firm. Isaiah walked slowly into the room, his heart pounding. "Catherine told me you've been acting out," Daniel said, "going through her things and sneaking around the house. Is that true?" "No," Isaiah blurted out. "I wasn't sneaking around. I was trying to—" "Isaiah." Daniel's voice cut through his words enough that Isaiah froze. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this behavior stops now," Daniel continued. "Catherine has been nothing but kind to you, and you need to start showing her some respect." Isaiah's mouth went dry, but, "Dad, no more excuses." Daniel snapped, "I mean it, Isaiah. Tomorrow is an important day, and I need you to be on your best behavior." Catherine sat back, her expression calm and composed, but Isaiah saw the flicker of triumph in her eyes. He wanted to scream. Later that night, Isaiah lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The walls of his room felt like they were closing in. And for the first time, doubt crept into his mind. What if Catherine was right? What if no one believed him? But then he thought about the documents in his backpack, the recordings, the photos. He wasn't imagining things. He knew the truth. He just had to make sure everyone else saw it too. The next morning, the mansion was alive with last-minute preparations. Guests began to arrive, dressed in designer suits and elegant gowns. The air buzzed with excitement, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Isaiah stayed out of sight, watching from the shadows as Catherine greeted the guests with her practiced smile. She looked flawless, poised and radiant in her wedding dress, her every movement calculated, but Isaiah knew what lay beneath the surface. His dad looked happy, but there was a nervous energy about him, like he was trying too hard to pretend everything was perfect. Isaiah felt a pang of guilt. He hated what he was about to do, but he knew it was the only way. As the guests began to take their seats for the ceremony, Isaiah slipped into the back of the room. His backpack slung over his shoulder, he spotted his dad standing near the altar talking to the officiant and took a deep breath. This was it. He just had to wait for the right moment. Catherine entered the room to a wave of whispers and applause. She smiled demurely, her eyes sparkling as she walked down the aisle. Daniel's face lit up when he saw her, and for a moment, Isaiah felt his resolve waver, but then he remembered the papers in his bag, the recordings, the lies, and he knew he couldn't let her win. The officiant began speaking, his voice echoing through the hall. Catherine stood beside Daniel, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they exchanged vows. Isaiah's palms were sweaty. He reached into his backpack and pulled out his phone, ready to play the recordings just as the officiant opened the folder with the marriage license. Isaiah stood up. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him. Catherine's expression faltered for the briefest moment before she recovered. "Isaiah, honey, what's wrong?" "Don't sign it, Dad." Isaiah's voice trembled, but he didn't back down. "She's lying to you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Daniel's eyes widened. "Isaiah, what are you talking about?" Isaiah stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I have proof," he said, his voice is steadier now, "proof that she's been lying this whole time." Catherine's smile disappeared. "Isaiah, that's enough," Daniel said, his voice sharp, but Isaiah didn't stop. He hit play, and Catherine's voice filled the room. "Once I have what I want, I'll make sure he never causes problems again." The room erupted and whispered. Catherine's mask finally cracked, her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Isaiah saw the real her, the cold, ruthless woman she had been hiding all along, and in that moment, everything began to unravel. The room stood frozen in stunned silence. Isaiah's voice still echoed in the vast hall, bouncing off the polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Every eye was locked on him, but Isaiah didn't flinch. He tightened his grip on the phone, his palms slick with sweat, and stared straight at his father. "Dad, please," Isaiah pleaded, his voice trembling but determined. "Don't sign anything. She's lying to you." Daniel stood by the altar, his face pale and eyes wide with disbelief. Catherine, still clutching his arm, turned sharply toward Isaiah, her carefully composed mask beginning to crack, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes darkened, but she forced the smile. "Isaiah," she said sweetly, though there was venom beneath her voice. "Honey, I know this is scary for you. Big changes can be hard, but we've talked about this. Your father and I love each other, and no—" Isaiah interrupted, his voice louder this time. He stepped forward, his small frame trembling but resolute. "You don't love him. You only love his money." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some of the guests exchanged nervous glances, and others leaned in, eager to hear what would happen next. Daniel took a hesitant step toward Isaiah. "What are you talking about?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge of panic beneath it. Isaiah swallowed hard. "I have proof," he said, holding up his phone. "I recorded her. She's been planning this the whole time. She just wants your money, Dad, and she wants to get rid of me." Daniel's face contorted in confusion. "What?" Before Isaiah could hit play, Catherine sprang into action. She dropped Daniel's arm and strode toward Isaiah, her heels clicking like gunshots in the silence. "That's enough, Isaiah," she snapped, her voice cold, now the sweetness completely gone. "This childish outburst has gone far enough. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're embarrassing your father and yourself." Isaiah took a step back, but he didn't lower the phone. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice shaking. "Just listen." He pressed the play button. Catherine's voice filled the hall, sharp and unmistakable. "Once I have what I want, I'll make sure he never causes problems again." Murmurs erupted among the guests. Daniel's face went pale, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What is this?" he demanded, looking at Catherine. Catherine's expression hardened. "It's nothing," she snapped. "That's not real. It's edited. He's just a kid. He doesn't know what he's doing." "Is it?" Isaiah didn't stop. He played the next recording, the one where Catherine talked about the prenup and isolating Isaiah the kid. "He'll be out of the way soon enough." The whispers in the crowd grew louder. Daniel staggered back a step, his gaze darting between Catherine and Isaiah. "Catherine," he said, his voice low and shaking, "tell me this isn't true." "It's not." Catherine shrieked, losing the last trace of composure. "He's lying. He's always been jealous of me. Jealous of what we have." Isaiah dug into his backpack and pulled out the printed emails and documents. "Look," he said, stepping forward. "I found these in her office. She's been planning this all along." Catherine's eyes darted toward the papers, and for a moment panic flashed across her face, but then her lips twisted into a sneer. "You little brat," she hissed under her breath, low enough that only Isaiah could hear. Daniel took the papers from Isaiah's hands, his fingers trembling as he flipped through them. With each page, his expression darkened. Finally, he looked up, his face hard and unreadable. "Catherine," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What the hell is this?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The guests leaned in, waiting for her to speak, but instead she let out a sharp laugh, cold and bitter. "You know what this is, Daniel," she spat, stepping away from him. "Don't act so surprised. You really thought I wanted you for anything other than your money? Look at you, an old man with too much power and too much trust." The crowd gasped again, louder this time. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" and another person pulled out their phone to start recording. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "I trusted you. Well, that was your first mistake." Catherine snapped. Her voice was rising now, and her face twisted with fury. "You think you're better than everyone else, that just because you have money you can buy love and respect. You're pathetic, and your son, your little spoiled brat, he's no better." Isaiah flinched at her words, but he refused to back down. He stood his ground, staring her down, even as tears burned at the corners of his eyes. Daniel turned to one of the security guards near the back of the hall. Call the police!" Catherine screamed. She grabbed one of the glasses from the table and hurled it at the floor, shattering it into a spray of glass and water. "You can't do this to me! You don't get to do this to me!" Two security guards stepped forward, but Catherine spun toward Daniel, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You think you're untouchable? You're nothing without your money. Nothing. Get her out of here," Daniel said quietly. The guards moved in, and Catherine tried to push past them, but they caught her arms and pulled her back. "You'll regret this, Daniel," she screamed as they dragged her toward the exit. "You'll regret this!" The doors slammed shut behind her, and the room fell silent. Daniel turned to Isaiah, his expression heavy with regret. "Isaiah," he said softly. Isaiah's chest heaved, and he wiped at his eyes. "I told you," he whispered. Daniel knelt down and pulled him into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry, buddy. I should have listened to you." Isaiah clung to him, the weight of the past few weeks finally crashing down. The guests began to shuffle out, murmuring amongst themselves, but Isaiah barely noticed. For the first time in weeks, he felt safe. But even as he held on to his dad, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that this wasn't over yet. Catherine might be gone, but the damage she had caused lingered, and Isaiah couldn't help but wonder if this was only the beginning of something far darker. The hall was eerily quiet after Catherine's screams faded into the distance. The shattered glass still glistened on the polished floor, reflecting the golden light of the chandeliers. Guests shuffled nervously, whispering in hushed tones as security escorted Catherine out of the building. The weight of what had just transpired hung heavily in the air, suffocating and thick. Isaiah stood next to his father, his small frame trembling despite his attempts to stay strong. Daniel's arm was draped protectively over his shoulders, but Isaiah could feel the tension in his father's grip. Neither of them spoke. Daniel's eyes were fixed on the documents Isaiah had handed him earlier. His fingers tightened around the papers as if they might crumble under the pressure. Isaiah couldn't tell if his father was more angry or heartbroken or both. The officiant cleared his throat nervously, stepping forward. "Mr. Carter, perhaps we should—" Daniel cut him off with a raised hand. "Not now." His voice was sharp, but it wavered slightly. He turned to one of the security guards lingering nearby. "Make sure she doesn't come back in here. Call the police and have them meet us at the house." Isaiah's stomach dropped. At the mention of the house, the idea of going back there, of walking into the same rooms where Catherine had whispered her lies and hatched her plans, made his skin crawl. "Dad, can we just—" Daniel squeezed his shoulder. "We'll talk about it at home," he said softly. "Let's go." The drive home was silent. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles twitched. Isaiah sat in the back seat, clutching his backpack with the evidence, as though Catherine might reach out of the shadows and snatch it away. He kept replaying the scene in his head. Catherine's mask slipping, her voice twisting with anger, her threats echoing even after the doors had slammed shut for weeks. Isaiah had imagined this moment, picturing himself feeling triumphant once the truth came out. But now that it had happened, all he felt was exhausted. When they pulled into the driveway, the mansion loomed dark and silent, the towering windows like empty eyes staring down at them. Daniel hesitated before getting out of the car, then turned to Isaiah. "Stay close to me," he said quietly, "and if anything seems off, I want you to tell me right away." Isaiah nodded, clutching his backpack even tighter. The inside of the house felt colder than usual. Catherine's perfume still lingered faintly in the air, and the flowers she had arranged for the wedding sat wilting on the dining room table. Isaiah's stomach twisted at the sight of Daniel locking the front door behind them. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed Frank. "Yeah, it's me. I need you to come to the house as soon as possible and bring someone from the firm." As Isaiah recognized the name, Frank was his father's lawyer. Hearing Daniel's voice, so steady and businesslike, gave him a small measure of comfort. But it didn't erase the gnawing fear that something was still wrong while Daniel paced the room, talking to Frank about restraining orders and pressing charges. Isaiah wandered toward Catherine's office. The door was slightly ajar, and the sight sent a chill through him. It was as if she were still there. Sitting behind the desk with that cold, calculating smile, he stepped inside. His heart pounding, the desk was cleared off, but Isaiah could still picture the stacks of papers and folders he had dug through. Suddenly he noticed something on the desk. A small black notebook. Isaiah's breath caught. It hadn't been there before he approached slowly, reaching out to pick it up. The first page was blank, but as he flipped through, his stomach dropped. It wasn't just notes. It was a diary. Catherine's diary. The entries were short but chilling. He's too trusting. I can work with that. The boy is a problem and needs to be handled before he ruins everything. If Daniel doesn't sign, there are other ways. If Daniel doesn't sign, there are other ways. Isaiah's hands shook as he turned the pages. The entries grew darker and more paranoid. He's watching me. The boy knows too much. I should have gotten rid of him when I had the chance. Isaiah slammed the book shut, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He turned and bolted out of the office, nearly colliding with his father. Isaiah, what look? Isaiah thrust the notebook at him, his words tumbling out in a rush. She left this? She was writing about us? About hurting us? Daniel took the book and flipped through it, his face growing darker with every page. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. Go upstairs and lock your door, he said. Now. Isaiah hesitated, but now the sharpness in his father's voice made Isaiah jump. He turned and ran upstairs, slamming his bedroom door behind him and locking it. Hours passed. Isaiah sat on his bed, staring at the door, listening for any sounds from downstairs. He tried to distract himself by playing games on his tablet, but his hands were too shaky to hold it steady. Finally, there was a knock at the door. "It's me," Daniel said. Isaiah opened the door, and his father stepped inside, his face lined with exhaustion. "She's gone," Daniel said, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "The police took her into custody." Isaiah let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Is it over?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet. She's facing charges, but people like her, they don't give up easily." Isaiah swallowed hard. "What do we do now?" Daniel reached out and took his hand. "We stick together, and we don't let our guard down that night." Isaiah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel safe. He couldn't stop thinking about Catherine's diary, the way she had written about him like he was an obstacle to be removed. He thought about her last words at the wedding, "You'll regret this." Isaiah knew it wasn't an empty threat. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it finally did, it brought nightmares of Catherine's voice, echoing through the halls of shadows, moving through the house, and of eyes watching him from the darkness. When he woke the next morning, drenched in sweat, he knew the nightmare wasn't over. The morning after Catherine's arrest, the Carter mansion felt like a hollow shell. The once bustling house, which had been alive with wedding preparations just a day earlier, was now eerily quiet. The scent of flowers and perfume still lingered, but the decorations had already begun to come down. The silence was unsettling, and Isaiah found himself flinching at every creak of the floorboards. He sat at the kitchen table, poking at a plate of untouched pancakes across from him. Daniel scrolled through his phone. His brow furrowed. His father hadn't said much since the police took Catherine away, and the tension between them felt like a wall neither of them knew how to climb. "Are you going to eat that?" Daniel finally asked, breaking the silence. Isaiah shook his head. "I'm not hungry," Daniel said. Pushing his phone aside, he looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept at all. "I know this has been a lot," he said. "Too much, and I haven't been handling it well." Isaiah glanced up but didn't say anything. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his eyes filled with guilt. "You tried to warn me, and I didn't listen. I let her get too close to me, to you, and I'm so sorry." The apology caught Isaiah off guard. He had been bracing for another lecture or some attempt to downplay what had happened. But hearing his father admit fault made the knot in his chest loosen, just a little. "I didn't know what else to do," Isaiah said quietly. "You were so happy, and I didn't want to ruin it, but I knew she wasn't who she said she was." Daniel reached across the table, resting his hand over Isaiah's. "You saved us. I need you to know that if it wasn't for you," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't even want to think about it." Isaiah swallowed hard, fighting the lump rising in his throat. "She's gone, right?" Daniel hesitated. "She's in custody," he said carefully. "But there's going to be a lot of legal stuff to deal with. She's already hired a lawyer." Isaiah's stomach sank. "What does that mean?" "It means she's not done fighting," Daniel admitted. "But neither are we." Later that day, reporters showed up at the gate. The story had spread fast. Billionaire Daniel Carter's wedding turned into a public scandal when the bride-to-be was exposed as a manipulative con artist. Cameras flashed outside the mansion as reporters shouted questions through the iron fence. Daniel ordered security to keep them back, but their presence only made Isaiah feel more trapped. He stayed away from the windows, but he could still hear their voices drifting inside. "Mr. Carter, is it true Catherine planned to steal your fortune? Do you think she was acting alone? Is your son safe?" Isaiah flinched at that last question. He didn't feel safe, not really. Frank Daniels' lawyer arrived that afternoon, carrying a briefcase and wearing a grim expression. He and Daniel disappeared into the study, leaving Isaiah to sit alone in the living room. He tried to distract himself with a video game, but his mind kept drifting back to Catherine's voice, the threats, the lies, the hatred in her eyes. He had seen her mask slip, but what scared him most was how easily she had fooled everyone else when Daniel and Frank finally emerged. Their conversation was serious. She's denying everything. Frank said her lawyer is claiming the recordings were doctored and that Isaiah planted evidence out of jealousy. They're trying to spin this as a family dispute instead of fraud. Daniel's face darkened. She admitted everything in front of a room full of people. They're saying she had an emotional breakdown. Frank replied that you humiliated her in public and caused her to lash out. It's weak, but it might be enough to drag this out in court. Isaiah's heart sank. What does that mean for us? Frank crouched down so he was at eye level with Isaiah. It means we're going to need every piece of evidence you collected, everything you recorded, and every document you found. It's all going to matter. Isaiah nodded, but the weight of responsibility pressed down on him. He thought catching Catherine would be the end of it, but now it felt like the fight was only just beginning. Over the next few days, the house turned into a war room. Daniel met with lawyers, accountants, and private investigators. Isaiah helped as much as he could, organizing files and rewatching the recordings to make sure they hadn't missed anything. But even as they built their case, Isaiah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He caught glimpses of shadows outside the windows, flashes of movement that disappeared when he looked closer. Phone calls came in the middle of the night, only for the caller to hang up as soon as someone answered. And one morning Isaiah found a single red rose left on the front porch. Catherine might have been locked up, but Isaiah felt her presence everywhere. One evening after another long day of meetings, Daniel sat down beside Isaiah on the couch. "Dan, you okay, buddy?" Isaiah shrugged. "I don't know, it just feels like it's not over." Daniel nodded slowly. "I feel it too, but we're not going to let her win." Isaiah looked up at his dad, searching his face for reassurance. "What if she tries to come back?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then we'll be ready." The next morning, the phone rang. Daniel answered, his expression shifting from calm to tense within seconds. "What do you mean she made bail?" Isaiah froze. Daniel's voice grew louder. "How could they let her out after everything we showed them?" He hung up and turned to Isaiah. "She's out." Isaiah's stomach flipped. "What do we do now?" Daniel took a deep breath. "We stick to the plan. Security's already been increased, and I'm having cameras installed around the property. She's not going to get near us." Isaiah nodded, but the fear wouldn't go away, because no matter how many locks they added or cameras they installed, he knew Catherine wasn't finished with them yet. That night, Isaiah sat in bed, staring at the shadows dancing across the walls. He kept the lights on, but it didn't make him feel any safer. Every creak, every rustle of wind sounded like footsteps. He reached under his pillow and pulled out his phone. Scrolling through the recordings again, he didn't know why. He just needed to remind himself that he wasn't crazy, that all of this was real. As he played the final recording, the one where Catherine had threatened to handle him, Isaiah felt a chill run down his spine, and then he noticed something in the background of the recording. Faint but clear was a sound he hadn't noticed before. A door opening. Isaiah's blood ran cold. He hadn't heard it when he recorded it, but now it was unmistakable. Someone else had been there that night, and suddenly Isaiah realized Catherine might not have been working alone. Isaiah sat at the dining room table, his legs swinging nervously under the chair. The house was quieter than it had been in weeks, but the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy, like the calm before another storm, across from him. Daniel scrolled through emails on his tablet, his face tense and tired. The news of Catherine's release on bail had shaken them both, and though the security guards outside gave some sense of safety, Isaiah couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching. The diary. Isaiah had found it sitting on the table between them, its dark leather cover looking more ominous now than ever. Daniel had read every word, and though he didn't say it out loud, Isaiah knew it scared him too. "She's out there," Isaiah said quietly. Daniel set the tablet down and rubbed his temples. "I know. What if she comes back?" "She won't," Daniel said, but the way his voice wavered told Isaiah that even he wasn't sure. "And if she does, we'll be ready." Isaiah didn't find much comfort in those words, but he nodded anyway. The days passed slowly. Security cameras were installed around the house, and a guard was stationed at the gate 24/7. Daniel's lawyers worked tirelessly building the case against Catherine, but the process dragged on. Isaiah threw himself into schoolwork, but he couldn't concentrate. He kept thinking about the voice on the recording. The faint sound of a door opening in the background. Someone else had been there that night, but who? One evening, while Daniel was out meeting with the lawyers, Isaiah decided to search Catherine's office again. He hadn't been in there since the night he found her diary. But something told him there was more to uncover. The office was exactly as they'd left it, tidy, sterile, and cold. Isaiah sat down at the desk and opened the drawers, rifling through the folders one more time. Most of it was paperwork he'd already seen, but at the very back of the bottom drawer he found something new. It was a receipt for a storage unit rental. Isaiah's stomach flipped. He knew this could be important, but he also knew it was risky. If Catherine had kept anything there, it might be dangerous. Still, he had to tell his dad. Daniel didn't get home until late, but when Isaiah showed him the receipt, the exhaustion in his eyes turned to focus. "We're going there first thing tomorrow," Daniel said. The next morning, they drove across town to the storage facility. It was small and unassuming, hidden between a row of warehouses. A bored-looking clerk handed them the key after Daniel showed his ID, and together they made their way down the narrow corridor to Unit 117. Daniel hesitated before unlocking the door, glancing down at Isaiah. "Stay behind me," he said. Isaiah nodded, his heart pounding. When the door creaked open, they were met with the stale smell of dust and cardboard. The unit was filled with boxes, neatly stacked and labeled, but what caught Isaiah's eye was the large safe in the corner. Daniel knelt down and inspected the lock. "It's fingerprint activated," he said grimly. Isaiah's stomach sank. "What do we do now?" Before Daniel could answer, his phone buzzed. He checked the screen and frowned. "The lawyers need me to come in," he said. "They've got new evidence from Catherine's financial records." Isaiah felt a pang of disappointment. "What about the safe? We'll figure it out," Daniel said. "For now, let's take what we can carry." They loaded the boxes into the car, but Isaiah couldn't stop staring at the safe as they left. He had a sinking feeling that whatever was inside could change everything. Later that night, Isaiah lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He couldn't sleep. His mind kept going back to the storage unit, to the safe, to Catherine's voice on the recording. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his backpack and slipped out of his room. The house was quiet, but he could hear the faint murmur of the security guards talking outside. He crept down the stairs, grabbed Daniel's keys from the hook, and slipped out the back door. The storage unit looked even darker and more imposing at night, but Isaiah didn't let himself hesitate. He used the key to get inside and stood staring at the safe. What was he supposed to do now? His fingers brushed against the smooth surface of the lock, and to his surprise, the scanner beeped, the door popped open. Isaiah's heart stopped. He stepped back as the door swung wide, revealing stacks of cash, passports, and folders, but what caught his attention was a small black box resting on the top shelf. He reached for it, his fingers trembling. Inside, he found photographs. Pictures of him and his dad. Some were taken at the mansion, others at the park, and a few even showed them through the windows of their house. Isaiah's blood ran cold. Catherine had been watching them for months, maybe even longer. Suddenly, a noise from the hallway made him freeze. Footsteps. He turned, but it was too late. "Hello, Isaiah," Catherine's voice said from the shadows. Isaiah's breath caught in his throat. She stepped closer, her face half hidden in the dim light. Gone was the polished, elegant woman from the wedding. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, but her eyes burned with the same hatred he remembered. "I told you this wasn't over," she hissed. Isaiah clutched the box to his chest. "My dad's coming," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Catherine laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "No, he's not. He's too busy cleaning up the mess you made." She took another step closer, and Isaiah backed away. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded. "Because I deserve better," Catherine snapped. "Your father doesn't deserve all that money, and you don't deserve the life you have. You're nothing but a spoiled little brat standing in my way." Isaiah's heart pounded, but before he could move, Catherine lunged. He dodged, grabbing one of the boxes and hurling it at her. It bought him a few seconds, just enough time to run outside. Headlights flooded the alley, and Daniel's voice rang out. "Hang out, Isaiah." Isaiah sprinted toward the car, and Daniel stepped out, his face filled with panic and fury. Catherine stumbled out of the storage unit, but this time the police were right behind her. The aftermath was a blur. Catherine was arrested again, this time for breaking bail and violating a restraining order. The evidence from the storage unit sealed her fate, and the police assured Daniel that she wouldn't be getting out again anytime soon. In the weeks that followed, things slowly began to return to normal. Daniel launched a charity foundation to help kids from underprivileged communities, naming it after Isaiah's late mother, Isaiah. Took pride in helping his dad, and for the first time in weeks he felt like he could breathe again. But the nightmares lingered. Isaiah knew the scars Catherine had left wouldn't heal overnight, but he also knew he wasn't alone. His father had his back, and together they were stronger than Catherine's lies. And as Isaiah stood beside Daniel at the foundation's opening ceremony, he realized that this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. Subscribe to the channel not to miss new videos, like and share this video with your friends. Maybe it will make them think. Watch other videos on the channel. There are many more interesting stories to come.